Hi there, my name's Vince, I'm a composer, and in this video I'd like to talk about melodic sequence in the context of composing music. A melodic sequence is a short riff or small melodic idea, a cell, that is repeated, and the repetitions are increasingly higher or increasingly lower in pitch. So for example, if my little melodic idea is ba da da da, then my sequence might be da 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 da, something like that. Or descending it could be da 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 da. I thought in this video I'd spend some time going through a bunch of different musical examples of where melodic sequence is used, some in more subtle ways, some in quite obvious ways, and hopefully all of this will just give you an idea about the kind of emotional effect it can have and how you can use that and put that in service of your own creative ideas and imagination. Then in the later part of the video, I'd like to break down the two main kinds of melodic sequence in terms of music theory, how they differ, what each type is good for, and also some practical considerations when it comes to practicing those ideas and incorporating them into your own work. So without further ado, here's our first musical example. So I'll just isolate the sequence there so you can hear it without any of the surrounding material, because there's quite a lot going on in that arrangement. So we have this basic idea, this fragment of a melody, ba 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 ba, and then that is just all taken down a step here, and then it's taken down another step and another step. So what kind of effect does this create? Why would the composer have maybe chosen to use a sequence here rather than something else, rather than just continuing to develop the melody in a more linear fashion? Well, for me, the effect that this sequence has at this point in the piece, after a couple of repetitions of the main tune, it sort of just breaks out. It's a kind of release of energy into this long kind of downward shape, using just one idea. It's kind of one idea spread across a long period of time through the use of repetition. And it sort of has this just like a joyous exclamation. It's kind of a shout of praise. It's kind of a woo, yay kind of shape that just happens along with the word Gloria, which of course means glory to the God of heaven. It's very exuberant. It's a kind of long firework that sort of happens as a melodic effect. Let's move on to our next music example, which is an extract from the main theme from Howl's Moving Castle by Joe Hisaishi from the Studio Ghibli film. The track is called Merry-Go-Round of Life. Let's have a listen. And so on. So I wonder if you spotted the use of sequence there. So we have a simple melodic idea, which is repeated and then taken down a step in the scale, and then down another step. And all of it is within the scale of G minor there. And then after the intro, it goes into this melody. It's a partial sequence, it's kind of a loose sequence. If we were to be a bit more strict about it, it might sound something like this. Then we might continue that sequence. For example. So the thing with sequences is that they can go on and on and on indefinitely, or until you run out of space on your instrument. So that would be a kind of like more perfect version of the sequence, but instead what we get is this. which follows the harmony much more nicely and creates more of a question at the end of the phrase. Let's now skip ahead in the piece and look at this later section, which also includes 2 examples of sequence. See if you can spot them. So, the 2 sequences in there were this whole opening melody is a kind of sequence. There's our first fragment, then the whole thing down a step. And then later we have this little ornamental descending idea. So if we play that in isolation. Here's the sequence if you were to extend it. So we're going across the scale of G minor harmonic. And we're just using that same idea, that same little hook each time and moving it down in increments of the scale. It's been tweaked slightly just to fit with the intention and the overall harmony and everything else. So there's a slight alteration in there. Because the rhythm is the same each time, as a listener you don't necessarily feel like the sequence has been interrupted, so it just brings me to the point that it's always good to trust your ears when making use of sequence. Don't be too hung up on whether it's exactly as it should be. Feel free to just tweak things, and if it sounds good, then it is good. Emotionally, the use of sequence in this context makes a lot of sense to me. Overall, the piece, like the previous example, has a kind of classical, vintage, slightly antiquated feel. This piece is obviously referencing a kind of classic Viennese waltz sort of style. But more generally speaking, the use of sequence in a characterful piece like this, which is set in a fantasy world where the normal rules don't quite make sense, it has this kind of slightly loopy, dreamy, kind of infinite quality. And so the idea of having little turns and little spirals and things like that seems to kind of really fit with the overall mood. So it's not necessarily about referencing a genre or a particular style of music, but it's just about referencing that idea of repeating patterns and infinite loops. Our next example is a very famous piece of classical music by Debussy. Let's have a listen. So the reason I include this example is as an example of something where it's not really a perfect sequence, but there is some intelligible shape and repetition to it. For me, the core idea is something roughly like this. Or perhaps something like this. It's a kind of repeating mixture of oscillations of a tone and leaps up of around a fourth, and it unfolds in a predictably downward manner, but the details of it are somewhat blurry. Let's just have another listen. You sort of know where it's headed. Of course, the rubato of the performance also helps to kind of mask it. So it has this wonderful mixture of predictability and surprise. The whole thing is just left in a very sort of organic, natural state. And so emotionally, this type of use of sequence is, yeah, it's very calming because it's something that you often find in nature, this combination of geometrical patterns, but also idiosyncrasies and unpredictability. This whole phrase kind of reminds me of like a falling leaf or a feather or something like that, where, yeah, there are these loops, these little cycles that occur in the motion, but you can't exactly put your finger on where it's going to land next. So that's the sort of thing that comes into my mind. The next musical example is by the contemporary film score composer Hans Zimmer. It's from Interstellar. Let's have a quick listen again to my just scratch arrangement for the purposes of this tutorial. So this whole soundtrack is filled with cycles and repetitions and sequences, and it's quite reminiscent of Bach in places. And I think that fits really well with the themes in the film, because it is all about a kind of underlying unity amid a sort of continual flow and flux of change and all sorts of things going on. Where's the sequence? So as you can see just by looking at this MIDI, parts of the pattern are completely static. This is what we would call a pedal tone, while other parts are clearly rising, and then this bass note falls at the end to give you a kind of slight sense of conclusion. But this inner line here, this da 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 da, this is our sequence here. So I just wanted to include this example to show you how you can combine something that stays the same with a sequence at the same time. It doesn't necessarily have to be the whole thing that moves at the same rate, but you can have the movement just occur to one part of a pattern. Here's another quick example. That's quite an interesting gateway to ideas in general, is like having a little fragment of an idea and then just moving one little part of it and repeating the whole thing but keeping everything else the same. I really recommend that as a little kind of creative jumping off point. The next track is something that I composed very quickly just for the purposes of this tutorial to demonstrate the use of sequence as a way of creating a kind of melody. But it's not exactly a melody in the normal singable sense, it's more of just a shape which progresses. So here we have this melodic idea, and then we move it through the scale. And we can just keep going. But that's the sort of idea that I started with, and then I just adapted it slightly to become my melody. Ba boo ba ba is quite a kind of angular melody with a lot of large interval jumps in it, but what I like about it is that it has lots of open space, and it kind of creates this open focus. So if you're trying to create a melody that's more open and more like texture, then you could try using a more sort of abstract sequence as the core of your melody. The next piece is by the film composer John Williams. It's an extract from one of the Harry Potter soundtracks, the third film, Prisoner of Azkaban, and it's from the scene where Harry is on the back of Buckbeak for the first time and they're soaring through the grounds of Hogwarts. So the part that I'm interested here is this kind of intro section, which is the build up towards the big soaring majestic melody. Sounds much better with a full orchestra. So what the sequences are doing here are essentially just outlining the chords. So what's interesting about the sequences here is that rather than being based or locked into scales, they're actually locked into arpeggios instead. So sequences don't have to just be for scales, they can be for any kind of pool of notes that you decide. Arpeggios, chord shapes and voicings, or just like anything really. So here's our pool of notes. And the pattern is just going to be 2 notes per step, if you like. So this is step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 4. And then we're going to do the same thing with D major. And then in the third sequence we have this instead. And so what's going on there is we've got the arpeggio, this is our pool of notes. Start here, down 1, then skip 1, then down 1, then skip 1, then down 1, then skip 1. And again, with the sequence, you can just keep going and going. So the point about this one is that we're using sequences to just essentially decorate some chords, to create some motion and some movement without necessarily having ear-catching riffs or melodies. We're creating lots of open space just by using sequences in a textural way. And specifically because we're in flight, and this is going to have a very kind of upward lift to it, we're using sequences that lift us up through the chords, through different patterns. So you can think about how you might use sequences at transition moments in your piece, whether they're ascending or descending. So all of this brings us to our final musical example. Very quick scratch arrangement again, just to demonstrate how you can use sequence to create some interesting contours and shape within this sort of descending chromatic sequence at the beginning. So here's our descending chromatic line. Chromatic just means using every possible note. So a chromatic scale would be using every single note. And that's essentially what this first phrase is doing. The gesture is just a downward scoop, but rather than just having it go straight down, we're using sequence to create some interesting patterning within that. So the sequence goes like this. And then it repeats. There's just a huge flurry of notes and of information, and we're not even hearing individual notes at this tempo, we're just hearing a sort of kind of sound. And so having some sequences in there, having some repetition of certain motions in there, just gives us a bit more interest, gives us more to kind of latch onto. And it can be just a really exciting way to create musical gestures without thinking so much about individual notes, but thinking more of notes as a whole and the patterns that they make. So now let's move from the examples to the more theoretical, more technique-based part of the video. So there are 2 kinds of melodic sequences to be aware of when you're composing. The first one is called a parallel sequence, and this occurs when you have a shape, for example like this, and you just repeat the exact same shape, the exact same relationship between the notes, but you're transposing the whole thing either up or down. For example, the kind of quality of the melody, for in this case it's a major triad, so it sounds major. Each time you play it, it sounds major, it sounds like a major triad. It's just that the whole thing has moved. It's sort of as if I've just used a pitch shifter and gone. You're hearing the exact same shape every single time, it's just that the kind of relative pitch is either higher or lower. The other kind of sequence is a modal sequence, where there's now a relationship between your initial shape and the underlying scale or pool of notes across which you're moving during the course of your sequence. So let me just show you what I mean. If I choose the C major scale, which is all the white notes on the keyboard, if I choose that as my chosen scale, or my pool of notes that I'm going to play the sequence with, then as I keep this shape, I need to stay within the pool of notes that I've chosen. So you'll notice now when I do this, my second step of the sequence, I've got this sound, which actually is a minor chord. Whereas before, when I was playing it in parallel, everything sounded bright and major sounding. This time I've got a kind of mixture of different sorts of qualities. That's another minor one. Major, major, minor. This is actually a diminished. And then we're back to the top of our sequence. So here's the key concept. With a parallel sequence, you're prioritizing the riff or the cell or the melodic kind of idea that you have. You're saying, this is always going to be the same no matter what. I'm just going to move it around in interesting ways. Whereas in the case of a modal sequence, you're prioritizing the pool of notes, i.e. the mode or the scale that you'll be using, instead of prioritizing the exact shape, which means that you just have to kind of tweak the shape a little bit as you go through the different notes of the scale in order to fit. So there's more of a kind of trade-off or a relationship there between the two elements. And the result is, with a modal sequence, you end up with a kind of colourful array of various different sounding things that sort of emerge from this interplay between the mode and the shape. Let's look at some more examples of parallel sequences so you can just get more of a sense of the overall sound of these things. Generally, to me, they sound much cleaner because you just have that exactness of the repetition. So let's take this idea and move it around in parallel. This time, instead of going up or down in steps, I'm going to leap up in minor thirds. So my target note each time will be here, 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 and here. So I'm going to play the riff on each of those starting points. So in succession. Oops. So it's got this very kind of pristine sound to it. Here's another parallel sequence. I'm going to take this idea and I'm going to go down chromatically. So it's exactly the same every time. It's like a potato print. Whoops. Let's take another one. We've got, for example, let's do that. This time, let's move upwards in fourths, for example. Another advanced thing that you could do is have your sequence describe a sequence. So with parallel sequences, this works particularly well. So let's take this as our basic sequence, going up in tones and a distance of a fourth interval between each note. And for each step of that sequence, we're going to do this. I call that the Simpsons motif. Now the next root is F, then it goes to Let's do some more examples of modal sequences. So this time I'm going to do something in D Dorian, which is nice and easy. It's all the white keys. I'm just going to find an interesting shape. So I quite like this. This is a D minor 6 kind of arpeggio. So there's like a triad there and then two notes here. So you've kind of got that going on. And move the whole thing up, but staying within the scale, which is all the white notes. So that's nice and easy. So that's quite nice. This time, let's try choosing a simple shape, but a slightly more interesting sounding scale. So let's choose G harmonic minor. And let's just do some simple triads over the top. So that's got some really interesting motions and moments in there. That's quite interesting. You get a kind of sharp 5 sound. Yeah, all kinds of good stuff going on in there. Of course, you could play it as chords. So when should you use parallel sequences and when should you use modal sequences? Well, one example of using parallel sequences would be when you want to create a kind of harmonically unstable or floaty sort of atmosphere, for example. That's using parallel sequences, and you'll notice that every time I moved the sequence along, the chords sort of had to go with it, otherwise it would create a lot of clashing. Alternatively, you could use parallel sequences to your advantage if you want to create that kind of clash and that kind of tension. For example, in C minor, if we go to the dominant chord and we want to create some tension before resolving back to C, then we could use a parallel sequence to do that. So there we've got all these things kind of stacking up, or we could use a chromatic sequence in parallel. That kind of thing. Or you could use this kind of thing based around diminished. So those are all examples of parallel sequences deliberately creating lots of clash against an underlying pedal tone, a note that just remains consistent. On the other hand, when you want your sequence to just ebb and flow with the music more naturally and just to adapt to what's going on in the musical context, then you're more likely to use a modal sequence, or a diatonic sequence, another name for it. These kinds of sequences where the exact notes adapt according to the harmony are much more common in general. So I would say parallel sequences are a little bit more of the specialist case when you want a particular kind of flavor. Modal sequences are more just your everyday run-of-the-mill kind of sequences. Incidentally, this is a great way to just get comfortable in different key areas. So say I want to practice my E-flat harmonic minor, which actually probably is something that I need to practice. Yeah, so I'm having to do a bit of thinking there, but the more I practice in that way, the more it becomes muscle memory. And this is one of those things that eventually just becomes something that you get a feel for. And it's kind of fun. It's much more interesting to sit down and come up with these little shapes and play over different modes and scales of your choice than it is to just boringly practice scales from bottom to top in a sort of boring, predictable way. Let's quickly talk about ways to cheat. With parallel sequences, you can obviously just play in your initial idea into your DAW and then just copy paste it and shift the whole thing up on the piano roll using MIDI. Or you could use the transpose function on your keyboard and just play the fragment and then transpose up a tone, for example, and play the same thing again. For modal sequences, it's a little trickier because you have to stay within the scale, but some DAWs have a scale lock feature. In the latest version of Logic, there's a scale lock feature in the transposer which you can set to record the output from, so it's possible to do it kind of in a slightly clunky way that way. If you're writing a sequence using one of the traditional modes like Phrygian, Dorian, Ionian, then there's a cheat that you can use when you're working in a DAW, which is to play your sequence just using the white notes and then transpose it after the fact into your desired key. But as I say, I can't overstate how fun it is to just internalize these sorts of things because I'm ultimately playing shapes that I find interesting. Here are 3 practice techniques which you can go away and implement straight away. Number 1, create some sequences just abstractly, either in your DAW or at your instrument. Just come up with a sequence and practice it like an exercise and just get really comfortable and fluid with it, really get it under your fingers. Number 2, take a sequence that you've created and then adapt it into a melody as a kind of exercise. So for example, say you have the sequence da 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 da, then the melody might be something like da 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 da. Bit boring, but you know, you get the idea. Number 3, take the last exercise and kind of flip it around. Start with a melody idea, a little hook or a riff or something, and then try and put a sequence in there or sort of adapt it so that a sequence fits in. So for example, you might have a melody that goes da 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 da, and then let's try spicing up with a sequence da 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 or something. So thanks very much for joining me on this exploration through the topic of melodic sequences for composing. I hope that was useful, or at least entertaining. And yeah, I'm trying to make more of these videos that are dealing a bit more directly with the question of how to go about writing music at a more fundamental level. So let me know if this was helpful or if you have any suggestions for future videos. In conclusion, melodic sequences are great. They're a very useful tool to have in your toolkit. And as always, don't get hung up on the theory. The main thing is just to have fun writing music, and you can practice these things in your own time, but when you're creating something, it's best to just forget about all of this stuff and just play what comes into your head. So good luck with that. Let me know any questions you have, and I'll see you in the next video.